Thank you all for coming out in the rain and braving the weather with us. I want to do some quick introductions. My name is Dan Bartman. I'm a senior planner with the City of Somerville. Up front here is Melissa Woods, another senior planner. Two team members from UTEAL. They're a design consultant firm that are working on the project. And we have Sue and Victor in the kitchen. I want to bring up that Alderman Connolly's here tonight. I believe Alderman Davis is out of the country, but he regrets that he couldn't be here. But I'm just going to dive right into it so we don't have to spend here all night here, even though we all love coming together, right? So the Davis Square planning process has been going on for a long time. We started in 2013. We kind of bring this up to remind everybody that this is an ongoing process, and that we're not anywhere near done yet, and there's a lot more work to do, but we have put a strong effort in so far, and we want to remind everybody that none of this has been forgotten. So anything that you participated in back then is still informing things today. This is where we're at right now, doing some neighborhood character meetings. We've been here since February, and there's one more after this meeting. The way that this format has kind of worked has been iterative throughout the process. We've been learning and researching about how to not only write design guidelines and how to use design guidelines, but researching buildings and how people interact and understand and read buildings, how our brains look at buildings. And we've been coming to you and asking you about what your preferences are related to the topics that we've been learning as we learn them with each meeting. The objectives for these meetings are to inform the future zoning ordinance that, or zoning that could be adopted in this is Davis Square. Sorry, I'm in too many squares. And that would play into things like building type and the height and massing of each building. But also, the point is to also understand the non-regulatory items, the things that I can't regulate, but we could handle through the design review with the design review committee. Today, projects kind of go through the effort of designing the building and apply to get a permit way before ever interacting with the neighborhood. And spend all that money and that time and effort into coming up with a design that may or may not be accepted by the neighborhood. And we think that process would work better if we did that first, and if we created some guidelines to help inform that process early on. This is where...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would it be better to actually invite the neighborhood to come to these meetings? Like, this is my only objection is that there's almost no notice of these meetings at all. You had to be on a certain mailing list, I think, and I mean, it doesn't feel like the city's doing much of making much of an effort to actually involve the neighborhood to get people's opinions. I know you have charrettes and these things that happen, but they're all like none of it's really noticed, and you know, might be like noticed in City Hall or something like that, but it doesn't seem like any efforts are made to just, you know, figure out who lives in Davis Square and actually invite the people who might be interested in coming to meetings. Wouldn't that, I mean, in terms of soliciting dialogue and getting it going, wouldn't that be helpful?
You may feel that that's true. I don't know if anybody else in the room would like to speak up about whether or not they feel that we've communicated when these meetings are taking place, but they're advertised on the city website. We reach out through social media. All of the videos are posted on city cable, and all of the meetings are advertised. So there's a lot of avenues that we've put effort into advertising these. I'm sorry?
Where are they advertised?
On the city calendar?
I know, but, you know, am I supposed to go to the city calendar every day to see if there's a meeting?
Well, I mean, all of you that have signed up for any one of these meetings are getting the email blasts.
That's not true. So I signed up, and I didn't get the email blast because I was told that you had to be on a different email list than the one I signed up for. I signed up for sort of a general, like, I'm interested in zoning and community housing, things like that. I didn't get the email because I wasn't on the Davis Square email list. I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but I bring this up at every single one of these meetings, and actually, I mean, looking around, very few people come to these because you guys don't make an effort.
That's not true. That's not true. Every single one of these meetings has had 50 to 60 people at every meeting, and this one had weather, and that's why you see the crowd that you do.
I guarantee if you were to ring doorbells around here and ask, hey, did you know that there's a meeting tonight about zoning code, building heights in Davis Square, things like that, I guarantee you that 95% of people would have no idea what you were talking about and had never heard about this meeting. I'm fairly plugged in, but I didn't hear about this.
We walk a fine line at the city. You talked about different mailing lists between, no notification segmentation possibly in your case, and people being on multiple mailing lists. And so we try to divide them up by neighborhood. So we have a Davis Square mailing list, which is how we notify people via email to their inbox that these meetings are taking place. We have also been advertising them on the city calendar. If you sign up for the Resistat emails, they're also noticed there. So please touch base with us about how else you think we can be reached. I'm sure you understand that manpower-wise, it is really hard to ring doorbells, but we'll do what we can, including posters in several businesses in the square.
Is it possible to register? I mean, we get phone calls from the city when there's like a snow emergency and so forth. Is that possible to be done by ward?
The mayor's office has told us they won't use reverse 911 like they would to communicate an emergency for a neighborhood planning meeting.
They do for like road races and stuff.
Like if there's a 5K in Davis Square, I get free phone calls, but
Yeah.
if my like housing value is gonna change, I live 2 blocks from here. I mean, if the value of my house is gonna change, I don't, you know, I have to have gone to the city website and have subscribed to the right email list, even though I've tried like 3 or 4 times to get on Resistat lists and things like that. I mean, it's to me, I honestly think it's just not, it's not right that you don't make more of an effort. And I'm not just trying to be ornery. I mean, I really feel like it's a basic right of people in this area to know about the zoning changes that are going to be Davis Square, and nobody knows about it. I can guarantee you that almost nobody in the neighborhoods around this building has any idea that this meeting is taking place, or even that there's a Davis Square plan that they're going to present to them. So I'll stop.
So I think there's some misnomers because we're not anywhere near making any decisions. That's why I made this slide, because we've been thinking a lot about some of the comments that have been brought up at other meetings where we kind of sprung the neighborhood character meetings on everybody after being on hiatus planning other neighborhoods without kind of explaining the process and how it might unfold previously. And one of the things that I wanted to point out tonight is that we're still in this phase of our neighborhood planning model. We're still talking, not presenting any decisions, not presenting any zoning concepts. A lot that you're going to see here is also a translation of an existing ordinance into a new format. But
in fairness, though, you make a big deal about the outreach component. You just put a picture of an invitation up as your first slide. There's a lot of sense of like there's charrettes and there's these things that we're all being invited to. And in my opinion, it's all phony. Like it's just your effort to involve people is phony. I'm sorry, that's how I look at it.
go ahead.
I'm going to suggest that you appoint this person to your outreach committee and we go on from there so that they can make sure that the next meeting is noticed and that you're part of the creation of the notice and how it's publicized. So basically you're volunteering to help publicize it, so let me go from there.
Excellent idea.
I've brought this up numerous meetings.
Okay, you are now on the committee to publicize the next meeting.
Alrighty. So far we've been, there are 5 meetings of discussion related to this topic. Each one of them are learning new things. We're doing research in the background and bringing that information to you each time and trying to engage you through activities that ask questions about the information and knowledge that we're gaining every time. This is where we're at today. We did some history and looked at the future of development in Davis Square. That we talked about scale of developments. Melissa's going to go through a refresher of where we've been already. And in today's meeting, we're going to talk about the difference between zoning and design guidelines. We're going to summarize where we've been, as I said, review the storefront exercises that we did last time, which is now a month ago, if I remember right. We did some upper story analysis, and then we're going to have another preference activity. Just so everybody realizes, this is not even the 5th meeting that we're going to do related to this topic isn't the end of planning in Davis Square. We have a lot more work to go on. We're working on figuring out with all of you what we want to do at this meeting, because there are a lot more topics aside from just neighborhood character and design guidelines that needed to be discussed in Davis Square before we can ever even write the draft of a plan document. Transportation and infrastructure is planning on holding a bunch of events in the summer to talk about traffic and redesign of streets and sidewalks again in Davis Square, in the core of Davis Square. And we're going to have a couple conversations with the Economic Development Division, probably in the fall, related to lodging and cooperative management, which might be a Main Streets organization or a BID, a business improvement district. So there's a lot more that's going to happen.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was very helpful to see your list of meetings planned and the topic for this meeting and for the next
Yep.
one, which is the last one's clearly scheduled. I care a lot about how things look. However, I feel like that in this sort of discussion structure, that's really all we've been looking at and not looking at it very imaginatively.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'm alone in this, but people can respond. To me, a more important question is, if we make such and such a zoning change, we can expect that to impact the economy and the cultural feeling and the people who live in Davis Square in such and such a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I might choose something that I think is less visually pleasing because I like its impact on the vitality and the life of
Mhm.
the square. So I'm having a hard time with exercises and with the structure because I don't feel like there's yet a vision of what it will feel like to live here and what it is we seek to create. And I feel like we're talking about, size of doors and size of windows, and what we haven't talked about is who do we want to have doing business here? Who do we want to have living here? How do we make that more or less likely to happen? And how can we use the zoning regulations to improve our chances of having the square develop in the way we want it to develop?
Yeah, and those are all important topics that we're definitely going to work with you over the course of the summer and fall if need be. I know that some people like to travel in the summer, that to figure out all of this you should think of as preliminary work that once we because we have to understand once we get to the specific sites where we might identify a certain thing or a certain use, the type of people that we want to invite into the neighborhood, the type of businesses. There's only so many sites in Davis Square that might be probable for redevelopment or rehabilitation. And you have to do detailed site studies, and you need this type of information going into that to focus that conversation. So not only is it about the use, but we have to understand how do you get an acceptable design from that use. A lot of this is setting the groundwork so that we can have that conversation.
But a lot of this for me, the message I'm not getting across is that a lot of this for me would change depending on what we decide is our collective vision for how the square lives. And so I feel like we're having these meetings talking about window sizes, et cetera, without talking about our much more basic and rooted vision for the square. I understand why they're both necessary. I feel like we're doing it.
I mean, again, we're not making the decisions about what this stuff is, right? We're investigating the existing condition. That's every one of these meetings has been about analyzing Davis Square as it is today and understanding that from a building design perspective. We have to, like I said, iteratively build every meeting towards getting towards our conclusion. If we jump right into site studies without having ever uncovered any of this, we might never have that conversation about what the existing character of Davis Square is. So we could invite things in without never knowing what they should look like. So you have to know where you are today to understand how to move into the future. Yeah, I totally understand it. I mean, the fact that we're here, though, will do just as much damage in pausing and doing that and then coming back to this as we did, honestly, having to go to Union Square and putting your process on hold. And I think we've acknowledged that. Like, had we been around in 2013, we could have just kept going and put out a draft. But that was the fault of the resources that we had available. So one of the things we want to do is complete this exercise and have it inform further conversations. So the first, one of the things that people have asked throughout all of this is what's the difference between things that we regulate and things that are design guideline that can inform a process of design review. I didn't get a chance to review this beforehand, but one of the things that's unfolded over these months in the winter and spring is that the next draft of our zoning ordinance rewrite has progressed very far, and we hope to release it in May. So I brought with me a preview of some of the pages. And so, there's still some graphics being made and some language being rewritten, but we anticipate a May release of a public draft, a public discussion draft. It's not going to be submitted to the board, but this is our opportunity to all spend 3 months with the document and figure out what it says, and we'll be out in the public explaining things to everybody across multiple wards. Our outreach team was working on that. Tom will take all of the advice that you've given us and make sure that we put forth a strong effort to make sure everybody that we can reach it knows about the project. So what we're proposing is a new system for regulating the city, and all of it is based on building types. I'm sure some of you have heard me say that in 2012, myself and 2 interns walked almost all of the streets of the city photographing and measuring buildings. We didn't really know what we were out doing. We just understood that we needed to figure out what the DNA of the city was. But what we uncovered was that there's different building types. And what kind of is the big crime that's going on today is that all of them are basically regulated the same. There's different districts and different height limits in different districts. But the same metrics are used for a commercial building in the bottom right corner as for a cottage in the upper left, basically, right? And what this new system does is it regulates different buildings differently. The other thing that we found was that there's all kinds of things that we call building components attached to the main portion of these buildings. So every house and detached house and on down the line, has side wings and rear additions and dormers and decks and all kinds of things attached to them that have their own metrics. And we measured a lot of those too and recorded data. One of the things that we did was in a database, we collected height and width and depth measurements of all these things, ratios of them to other parts of houses. And we took the 15th and the 85th percentile of that whole range and removed it and said that's the range that we're willing to accept, because there is a lot of variety. And so we wanted to make sure that we provided a parametric code that allows a range of possibilities, but within reason. So we wanted to get rid of the outliers. But also, in addition to building types and components, there's frontages. In Davis Square, you probably only have 3 or 4 of these. But this is a storefront over here on the left, a lobby entrance, and these are just graphical representations of those, and a stoop entrance. But the way the whole system works can be described by this graphic here. You just take the main body of a building, of one of the building types, a number of components that could be added to it. Again, all of those are regulated separately, and then frontages to make a Somerville building. And we have models of all of these things, and you can literally assemble and sketch up hundreds of examples of Somerville buildings. This works kind of like puzzle pieces. Components and frontages connect to building types. We've been going around telling everybody we feel that this works more like Legos. Legos have a patent about how things go together, and we wanted to create a code that also provided that same instruction, so you don't end up with weird, monstrous rear additions and dormers that consume the whole roof. If they have their own patent, essentially, and how they all connect to one another, you have a more predictable system for how houses can grow and change over time. Not only houses, but all buildings. This is kind of how things happened back in the day, even when Somerville was first being developed. This is a Sanborn map along Claremont and Moore. That if you look, I colored in red the different parts that you're looking at. So in red is the main body of the house, and in yellow and green are different rear additions. Porches are colored in blue, and the porches kind of all follow this setback line. So we propose to regulate porches the same way. Instead of porches counting against the setback, they're allowed to encroach the front setback a certain distance, and it actually promotes the creation of new porches. And that has a social component to how the neighborhood functions when there's places for people to sit outside and see each other. We all realize the value of Porch Fest, right? The difference is, compared to our existing system, is related to floor area ratio. All of these buildings that I just showed you all have height, width, and depth metrics related to them, instead of a ratio of floor area to lot area, right? When you have a certain size lot, you can have a certain amount of floor space in the existing system, and you can move it around on a lot and create a building that has various different forms. That's one of the problems that we experience today in our neighborhoods. This is more like Play-Doh, right? And that's the big difference between our proposed ordinance, Legos, and our existing ordinance, Play-Doh. I often show pictures of the fact that you can create a house out of Play-Doh, but you can also make a dinosaur, and that's the problem. This is a graphic that I stole from our consultants, but all of these development concepts are 200 units, right? And you can create any one of these possibilities with floor area ratio. Now, you might bring up that, well, if I have a height limit here, then I get rid of that tall building, right? But you don't get rid of any of the low rise. There's nothing preventing me from building an apartment building. But what we want is more predictability from our ordinance than any of these possibilities within 200 units or so much floor space. The reason is that when does anybody know where this is? On Endicott? This is a former like commercial garage and parking lot. When this happens in our neighborhoods, an 8-unit apartment building typically comes along, and we all know that it's more desirable to have that show up as 8 units in 4 houses. And the new code can do this because it understands building types and smaller lots. The old code would produce this because it has floor area ratio, and it's easier to construct this, but this is the character of our neighborhoods, and that's the value of the building type model. So that's what the new code has within it. The other value is that you can group building types to create districts. So you could decide that you want a duplex, an apartment house, and a general building in a district, and give it some name because it's appropriate for Ball Square, let's say, and then that's the Ball Square district. But grouping all these is how we've been creating districts. You might think that the 4-story district here along the bottom is a good representation of what Davis Square is zoned for today. So here's a page, an example page from the 4-story mid-rise district. Again, all those 3 building types that are permitted within it, and then a sketch of an entire city block with those 3 building types that are all correctly sized. I made our consultants model these in SketchUp and then hand draw buildings that actually meet the metrics of the ordinance to kind of give you an idea about what it might look like if a full block was built like that. Now, a lot of development is going to be piecemeal, one building here, one building there, but in the eastern side of the city, these illustrations will be really helpful because we'll have full blocks being redeveloped over time. This is a building type page. There's 4 columns. Can you hear all right in the video? Yeah. So the first column is lot standards. We regulate lot width to ensure that we get more contextually designed buildings and instead of longer uncontextual buildings. This also is in a more efficient use of land. We only have so many square miles, 4 square miles to deal with in Somerville. We have to be very smart with how we divide up properties or how we allow people to divide up their properties and build infill development. The other thing is that we have a measure called green factor. It's a new tool that's more dynamic than landscape standards. It's actually a point-based system, and the more quality that you put into your landscape design, the more points you earn. And it also provides flexibility in that you can earn points for different things. The Parks Department and landscape design are working to even create a point system that's flexible for different areas of the city. So if you live near a highway, you could put in plants that are better at pulling toxins out of the air and earn more points because you live there than a place that doesn't have that. Another place might deal with flooding, and so they would have different point system. The second column is building placement. This is essentially setbacks. Every zoning ordinance has setbacks. We do the same thing. The blue area that you see is a range of possible setback area. The building has to be built somewhere within that blue area, the front facade of the building. There's also parking setbacks. The third column is massing and height. We spent a lot of time in our pretty much second and third meeting talking about massing and scale of buildings. This is the nuts and bolts of all of that information. There's a generic general building, which we talked about previously, that was pulled from measurements taken around the city. That could be calibrated for different districts. So if you in mid-rise 4, mid-rise 5, mid-rise 6, mid-rise 3, you might the standards would change because those are different heights and floor plate sizes. The fourth column is one of the most important ones for what we've been talking about, in that it regulates the composition of a facade and the use and occupancy of the building. Here's a blow up of that column over on the left-hand side. So it has ground story and upper story fenestration standards and blank wall limits on how much blank wall you can have. And we have an illustration in the front of the code that shows you how that's all measured. So you want, high, lots of transparency on the first floor for storefronts, not as much for residential up top. And then you want to make sure that not too much blank wall shows up on your buildings because it actually bores our mind. And it has a lot of impact on whether or not we'll continue to walk down a street. So if you encounter a big blank wall between two active storefronts, you're actually more attuned to turn around and walk away from that blank wall.
Can I ask about blank walls?
Sure.
Because one of the very prominent blank walls in Davis Square is the back of the CVS building.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being told at the time that was required to be a blank wall because it was not the property line. And is that something that could be changed in the zoning so that requirement is, so that it is no longer necessary to put a blank wall just because you're at a property line?
It's not required by zoning specifically. Where there is a requirement is in the building code. The building code doesn't require a blank wall, but the closer you get to a property line, the more fire rated any window has to be. So there's a range that's like 8 feet and then 3 feet and then 0 feet. The window has to be fully sprinklered. And so that has an impact, especially in a commercial area. And when the building's fully commercial, it has different impact than if it's also residential. I don't know if you look around closely, you'll see buildings that have the sidewall at the side lot line has no windows either, right? That building's anticipating another 0 lot line building being built up right against it.
That is probably true for the CVS building too, but while we're waiting for that other building to go there, it would be nice to
Right.
have some windows. Maybe those windows could be bricked up later, but it would have been nice to have some variety on that facade.
Right, but there's not actually, it's the interplay of decision making that decides that building got built that way. The blank wall standard is related to architectural features also. You can have no windows, but you have to provide texture and features to that building so that
In which case, there's none of that on that building.
True, yeah. That building's a great example. So is the back of the bank when you exit the T station. We've hired some consultants that arrive in Somerville for the very first time via the red line, and they come out and what greets them is a big blank wall. And that's one of the first things they show us. Look at this picture I took when I first visited your city. There was
Does a mural count as blank wall, or does it count as not blank?
no anything that provides visual interest ends up piquing our brain enough to keep us walking, keep us interested. Not deter us from interacting with the environment.
So even if there couldn't be windows in that wall, something else could have been put there
Yep.
to make it better.
Yeah. And actually, I don't have an example of it, but Ann Sussman, who's somebody that we'll bring up later in the presentation, has been doing a bunch of analysis with people in the area, and we gave her our full photo library of Davis Square. She is monitoring people's biometrics and showing them pictures of good and bad buildings, blank walls, articulated walls, and not asking them any questions. She's monitoring their heartbeat and their sweat glands and an EKG device, and it's telling her information about what we find acceptable, what turns us off, all that kind of stuff. But she used that specific building and put a mural on it.
CVS building?
Yeah, and when it's fully blank, we pay no attention to it because our brain subconsciously decides it's not worth caring about. And that's not what we want people to think about our buildings, right? We don't want them to think that they're not worth caring about. But when she added a mural, their eyes actually left the street and went and spent a lot of time on the mural.
I'll also mention before we go on to this, because you mentioned murals, we used to have a really nice mural on the side of Rite Aid, and Rite Aid painted it over one day without any permission from the artist or any interaction with anybody in the neighborhood.
Yeah, unfortunately, murals that aren't part of a subsidized mural arts program like Philadelphia are hard to protect, and that was one of the fallbacks of that specific mural. Unfortunately was also depicting famous women from Somerville over the generations, but yeah, that was a definite loss for many people. The other thing that we regulate here is the distance between doors. This is one of the outstanding features that Gale Architects from Copenhagen focuses on. They studied this when we brought them to Somerville and did the city's first public space, public life survey. The distance between doors and the number of doors along a street is something that's very important for having street vitality and walkability and visual interest. That was also something we presented. You'll see a couple slides that show where, the doors on Elm Street versus some other streets that we talked about previously. Moving on to components, each one of these has its own little column because it needs less regulations than a full building. But each item, whether it be an awning, an entry canopy, a bay, a balcony, has a few standards and metrics that guide the development of that little piece. And you can choose to add balconies to your project or a bay at your own whim, but there's a small amount of standards for each one. And the same thing for frontages. So this isn't an exhaustive list. It's an example of the frontages that are permitted in the Mid-Rise 4 district, which I think is pretty synonymous for what is the zoning district that is mapped here today. Now there are 4 building design standards that are written out, and they have a couple pictures, but they're not in the same tables, right? These are in addition to this part-based Lego system. And one that is really important is that our buildings have to have surface relief. I think this graphic covers really what I'm talking about. All of this contributes to the blank wall measurement too, right? And these architectural features contribute towards a non-blank wall. It provides visual relief, or surface relief and visual interest to the building.
That's the difference between the credit union building and the B-Fresh building. That's exactly what you have there.
This is also not an exhaustive list. I tried to identify a bunch of architectural features in this list, and then just stopped and wrote "and other architectural features." You just have to do stuff to your building. If you just put in a coplanar facade that's a flat material with no relief, no texture, and flat windows, this would trip you up in that proposed design. This is a building from Washington D.C. that I think is a great example because was the original design, very flat, right? There's no real visual or surface relief to it, and people hated it, and they lobbied and lobbied and lobbied when it got sold to have it rehabbed to add more visual interest to it, and they did that by adding some metal poles on the outside. And one of the other things that you can see that they did was switch from a very horizontally feeling building to one that added some vertical interest to it also. They actually didn't get rid of any of the windows. They just added more detail to it. So that's kind of like what that standard calls for.
Changes the color,
Yeah, they did change the color too, yeah. The next one is related to setbacks, right? So I wrote this so that every building in a commercial area or a square has a 2-foot setback, which is different from what things might have today, which has a 0-foot setback. And we did that on very purposeful reasons. The first one is that we wrote a sentence that allows all of that surface relief to project into that 2 feet. So the same way we incentivize porches by allowing them to project into the setback, we allow all of columns and pilasters and cornices and weird metal things sticking off of it, whatever. All of that stuff is allowed to project as part of the architectural design of the building. It helps kind of counteract the fact that I made it a required element to allow it all to project. But the other thing, you can just see, here's another example of that. This entire storefront is applied to the actual plane of that building, and all of it is projecting into that 2-foot setback that we would see for each building. But that also allows you to claim that 2-foot area. If you put out a planter or some seats, or you hang an awning, like at a commercial business, or put on your A-frame sign to advertise your goods inside, all of that needs a permit from the Board of Aldermen, right? And the reason it needs a permit is because the Board of Aldermen want to make sure that you have insurance, right? In case anything you do in the right of way doesn't, if it ever causes harm, that the city is not held liable for something that you did, right? We allow this to be, we allow all this to be in that area, and anything that encroaches into the public right of way needs to still get that permit. And the reason that we allow that this would now be allowed is because it's actually not in the public right of way. So it's on private property. You're allowed to do it, and you don't actually encroach. If you want to imagine a front property line right there, there'd still be a viable sidewalk in front of that building, and the tripping hazard or the overhanging the public realm issue is decreased. We also have a maximum front setback. And the reason this exists is because we want to make sure that streets have a street wall that is made by buildings. We talked about this a lot in the first or second meeting because our brains have an area that recognizes spatial definition. Was anybody here for that meeting where I talked about spatial definition? So this is the parahippocampal place area. When you show somebody this, their brain lights up in real urbanism. If you also show them the interior of a room, their brain lights up. It's uncontrollable. It happens automatically. We recognize spatial definition. And that's why you see regulations have a maximum front setback. It's often called a build-to line also. But it doesn't have to be 15 feet. It could be 11 feet. It could be 9 feet. And the reason is because we want to make sure that variability is allowed to happen. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a flat wall. But we want it to be a wall within reason and within relative range from one building to the next. And it still creates that feel of enclosure.
So is that considered good or bad?
This is considered good. Yeah, and you can see, this is actually from a project in Louisiana where somebody showed a variable setback being utilized through reconstruction. But you can see that front area that gets that the building sets back from can be utilized for other things that enliven the sidewalk. The second thing is, or the third thing is that every storefront has to have a frame that it fits into. We wrote this originally with just this top sentence, right? Which says that there has to be a beam held up by 2 columns. I have photos of this in modern buildings and traditional buildings. It happens all over the place. But one of the things, and the reasons that I brought up that this has been an iterative process for us, these meetings that we've had with you, is that, does anybody remember this slide? One of the things that we talked about was that our brain likes to have some structural order and an understanding of how a building fits. And the illustration that we found that was showing that drew this picture. And when we went and looked at Davis Square's buildings, it had done that exact same thing, right? These columns were going the entire way up and down the building, and they weren't supporting a cornice that went the whole way across. So we had to make another option, right? This is actually a beam between 2 columns. But that column, when it's a column coming from the upper stories, whether or not it's the 2nd floor up or the 3rd floor up or the whole way up, it's another option that you find in storefronts. Later on, we're going to talk about spending meeting 5 with all of you doing a walking tour, looking for things that we can't unsee. And ever since we discovered this, I haven't been able to unsee it everywhere I walk around Boston, right? And buildings all over the place, modern and traditional, do one of these or the other. Sorry. One of these 2, all over the place. So we wrote and we made sure to edit that in the code because of the work that we did here in this room together. The fourth thing and final one, this is kind of mundane, is that we want to make sure that vents and exhausts and any other utility feature on a building blend right in with the architecture. Can you see the vents on these? So up here, right? This is replicating that beam between columns, right? This is actually a beam supported by columns, but that's the vent right there. So it blends in pretty well. This is actually in the Fenway area. What we don't want to happen is for all of our buildings to have acne, right? This gets really noticeable really quick. But the reason this happens is because people are trying to, in newer buildings, we're putting washers and dryers in every apartment, right? You don't see this a lot in old buildings because everybody didn't have a washer and dryer. When this exists, you have less room to run the exhausts of first floor restaurants and whatnot up through the building as well. So often that's why you see vents on the front of the building nowadays. whereas previously everything would be vented out the back or the side of the building. I don't know if anyone gets off Leechmere and walks to the mall, but there's a new, I don't know, like falafel place or something that's there that actually vents under the arcade that you're walking in, and it blows its food smell down on you. I think it might be the best advertising I've ever encountered. Through all of this, there is still a ton of design flexibility. Most of the code stops here, right? These buildings that you see at the bottom are designed to be different architectural styles. This one has a canopy over the windows. This one has awnings. Both of those are permitted by the ordinance. This one has this is called a dooryard. This is called a stoop. Each one of those are permitted by the ordinance. So you can actually achieve a lot of design flexibility, and that's why this building, in its basic form, can also be that building, right? All of this is possible under the new setup that we have proposed. Both of these buildings would be permitted by the ordinance. But when both of these buildings are permitted by the ordinance, how do we know which one fits in the character with the neighborhood, right? So that's where all kinds of questions like these come into play, and that's what design guidelines inform. So that's kind of a synopsis of the things that get regulated, but none of these questions are answered through regulations. They're answered through a process of design review that some buildings need to go through and others don't. And part of that process is for us to figure that out and what questions are worth caring about. Is it that we want any blank wall to be muraled, or to have, do we want windows to be vertical or horizontal? We're not answering that question tonight, but we're looking at what exists in the neighborhood related to a lot of these. It could talk about whether or not windows are aligned vertically or horizontally. Should we encourage arched windows? One of the things Melissa hasn't been able to unsee in looking at Davis Square is that there's arched windows everywhere, and not many of us paid attention to that fact previously. Should windows be punched into walls? Should they be coplanar with the wall? Should they project from walls? All kinds of stuff, materials and textures, all of that stuff is not regulated. But through a process, it can be figured out, and we can write guidelines that suggest what people should do in their design proposals so that we get buildings that are more designed to fit in with the character without stipulating one architectural style. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Melissa, and she's going to review the previous 3 meetings.
Question just in terms of what came first, the chicken or the egg. If you're thinking about designing around are you basing it on what's already there? Or do you say, this is what we want to build towards, or this is the design we want to build towards, and any existing building that needs to be renovated cannot be grandfathered to the way it used to look, but has to adapt to the new look?
So both of those are possibilities for us to decide as a community how we want to apply to redevelopment and rehabilitation of buildings. We can decide that a simple change of use from one restaurant to another doesn't have to redesign the storefront, because maybe it's more important to make sure that that place doesn't sit vacant longer than necessary to us, right? But it might be valuable to get that. Maybe it only has 20% fenestration on the first floor. It's only 20% glass. And the code wants to have 70% because great storefronts have lots of glass. But so it could require that. But those are all decision points that we can make together. There are going to be proposed triggers for all sorts of stuff like that related to rehabilitation and redevelopment. Of course, redevelopment would follow the letter of the law. Rehabs and alterations of nonconformities and things like that all have a separate set of rules. But all of that plays out in figuring out how your ordinance would work.
Within the ordinance, is there a process spelled out to get relief from the ordinance?
Yeah. And it is applied differently in different conditions. One of the things that we have a possibility for is that things can be figured out and leeway can be provided through design review, and maybe something, for instance, the percentage related to the full width of a building that a bay is allowed to be, right? A normal bay is probably about 8 feet by 2 or 3 feet deep on a house, but a lot of times they're bigger on other buildings. We have some standard metrics that we've kind of always operated by. 50% of the full width of the facade can be projected as a bay. But you might find that different in different areas of the city. There might be a pattern of 30%. And if somebody's trying to propose a specific use or something where it would really make all the difference if that was allowed to be 40 feet instead of 30, we could create a process that allowed some flexibility through design for that. It's a little bit different than today's world is either special permit or not. And we're looking for more mechanisms that allow things to adjust appropriately for different designs. But
When do we have a conversation about whether we would like the zoning regulations to incentivize unusual, unexpected design versus predictable design? When do we have that conversation?
So that's going to play out all summer. We're gonna put out this. Yeah, Melissa and Victor are figuring out the schedule for ward-based meetings, and that's going to start the process off. What'd I say?
Instead of graphical based?
No, ward-based. Yeah. To begin that discussion with everybody, and even do meetings to explain what the document says and depicts in its language. But that's the first process, is explaining everything and going over everything with everybody. We'd really like to run them primarily like an open house, so that it's all about us explaining everything before anybody misconstrues anything or doesn't understand a sentence. I'd rather sit down and explain it with everybody. But that's why it might take the course of the summer. The Board of Aldermen has to handle the budget during the summer and a lot of other things, so it's a perfect opportunity for us to put this out in May and then engage the community related to its contents.
How big is Davis Square?
We took the map out of this presentation.
Yeah, so there's the Davis. So it depends on what you're talking about. I think for design guidelines, we're talking about sort of the commercial core, the Elm, Holland,
Yeah.
but the Davis Square neighborhood, extends up to Powder House, down to the city line. Yeah.
Along those lines, I know on Summer Street,
They took a lot that was a residential lot and joined it to a commercial lot and called it a single lot in mixed use. In my mind, that should not be allowed to happen, because what it in effect is happening is you're taking commercial and extending it into the residential. You're changing where the boundary is. Is there anything in the new zoning that would prevent that, or can that be put into a zoning that is not, you're not allowed to create a mixed use?
You're bringing up a great example of something that we'd like to take up in the summer. I know what site you're speaking of, and I haven't looked at it specifically. I know what was permitted under the existing code. I haven't looked at what's proposed under the new code. The proposed code is much more nuanced in its lot development, and we could really unpack that
so
this
the
summer.
answer is, there isn't right now something in that.
The new ordinance would not permit, for instance, a house to be built in a commercial district or a commercial building to be built in a residential district. It's all building type based, and those buildings have uses in them, but you wouldn't be able to say that they're one, even though it's one lot, it's split by a zoning district, and that zoning district says you can't build a house over here, or vice versa with a commercial building. So there would be that protection. We don't do existing case review, and so I don't know any details about that specific property. Melissa's heard about the situation.
No, that's not
In the-
there.
I want to look at your question more specifically and the lot conditions.
We'd have to look specifically at the loophole that people believe exists that is being exploited today.
Not a loophole, it happened.
Was it already approved?
It's-
Yeah.
We may not want to see that.
Yeah. So, but in a blink response, I'd say that the building type wouldn't let that happen, because a house has to be residential and a commercial building has to be commercial, right? So if you can't cross that boundary line, but I'd have to look and see and make sure that there's not some other path that they utilized.
And the answer is, I don't know off the top of my head, and I'll get you my business card at the end of the meeting, and we can set up a meeting to look at that lot and the proposed zoning, and answer your question specifically.
That lot is done.
It is done. It
Right,
has
it's
an
an
approved
example.
project that's been through litigation and
Yeah, that-
it's
For
decided.
the future.
It's
Yeah.
an example
Yeah.
to use.
Yeah, no, we understand that. Yeah, we understand that.
There's a proposal to remove a whole bunch of lot lines around Powderhouse Circle, so this could happen again.
Right, and it's a problem with the existing ordinance, so you're 100% correct. This exists in the existing ordinance, and it's a loophole that's gonna exist until it's changed. It's actually not a loophole, you're right, it's a process that is allowed to happen under the existing ordinance. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, let's assume all this is adopted in some form. And I'm a developer, and I'm looking at Cambridge, Somerville, Malden, Everett, Arlington. Competitively, what would this mean for Somerville?
It makes,
Would it scare people off? Would it invite them in?
no, everything, all of our interactions with the development world is about how they're looking for more predictability. And so what we're saying to everybody is we want to talk about what we want to tell people we want built here, and then make that the rule. So that when somebody goes to develop, they're not proposing something that's wildly out of our expectations.
I
And-
understand that. The question is this, let's just assume that the core of the development, it's not the whole thing, but the core is running the numbers so that you make money. Is this going to be, is the predictability a trade-off with burdensome regulations? How does it look? I'm ignorant. This is asked from a question of ignorance.
Yeah.
Position of ignorance. How would this look if I want to put a commercial or mixed-use building? I'm assuming you could have residential plus commercial in Davis Square. If I want to put something like that in Davis Square as opposed to Central Square or Arlington Center, what does it look like for me?
It spells out in more detail things that we don't tell you up front today, but make you do over the course of planning your project anyway. So it puts all of that information forward.
So in Boston, everything's by negotiation. So you.
Negative.
Yeah.
That's negative.
Well, it depends. It could be positive too.
Well,
But why
no,
would
doing
you
it, hold on.
vote for what you wanted?
Doing it through a zoning approval process is terribly inefficient, and it requires the neighborhood to not put a plan forward for how they want to develop in the future, but to fight a fight that they don't have time to fight on a daily basis. Over and over and over again.
Now, what about,
Cambridge does the same thing because they won't entitle a project beforehand that isn't the letter of the ordinance, and all of the developers want to build over what's entitled today. So they go through the same process through different means. Article 80 says that's the process in Boston. The Cambridge zoning ordinance is kind of under-zoning the city until some developer shows up. That's why you see what's happening in Central Square as a big fight right now, because developers want to build more development than what the zoning ordinance says. And so there's proposals for single sites. I just talked about this before the meeting started on changing the ordinance with no plan. And Melissa and I have been invited by city councilors over there to ask how we're doing things differently to create a plan for how the city should develop into the future. But
The one thing the zoning does do, the zoning proposal does do, is implement the Gilman and Lowell neighborhood plans, which are completed neighborhood plans in other neighborhoods of the city.
and could you also comment on Malden, Everett, Arlington, and Medford?
Well, we'd be happy to have that conversation with you at a later time, because we have a bunch of other stuff, and we're having topic-based meetings related to this.
But just in general, I mean, does this make us more or less attractive? That's my question.
It depends on the return of investment. I mean,
Yeah, well, but
I mean,
it's a matter of, if someone wants to develop in Everett and they have less stringent regulations, then that's fine, but is their return on investment going to be as high as if they would develop in Somerville?
Or are they allowed to build higher in Everett, or, we're asking for some comparison.
Everett doesn't care what it looks like, unlike Somerville.
Yeah,
I don't
they're
know.
two different.
I'm not, all I want to know is a market question. Has anybody done any sort of market analysis
There's 6
in
analysis.
connection with this?
The
Yeah.
Board of Aldermen asked us for 6 topic-based analysis the last time our zoning code was proposed, which is in a similar ilk to what it is now, except we've made improvements based on those studies and other community feedback, and those are all available at somervillezoning.com.
I'm sorry, is one of them a market analysis is my question?
It includes an economic development potential analysis.
And a housing analysis.
And a housing analysis.
So, but not a economic development.
Economic
Are you
development.
asking if there's an analysis about whether or not the specific metrics are more competitive compared to the other 6 other ordinances?
Well, I want to know how competitive, it's like if we were the state of Massachusetts, how competitive are we for larger scale developments relative to other states?
Yeah.
And we're assuming, as you also assume, a development community that runs the numbers.
One of our economic development planners is waving in the back.
But that depends also on the zone, because if you're thinking on Union Square,
Yes.
that's very competitive for a lot of people that wants to deploy a lot of money and get a return on the investment. We are talking here something different. This is up to what scale we can do a development that is appropriate for the city, talking your topic that is on tax revenues, schools, police, fire department. So all those things has to be taken into consideration, but also is the neighborhood, how high can we go, how dense can be the development. So it's actually competitivity comes out of depending what return you want on your money. I don't think that those are big scale developments anyway. So really we cannot be competitive to Kendall Square. But we can be in places like Union Square, we can be in places like Assembly Square. Here we have some areas, some spots that we can develop, some buildings can be fairly big, but on the other hand, is also the neighborhood is agreeing on that. Can we get better taxes out of those buildings, triple it, or going 10 times the amount of taxes? But that's exactly what they're trying to do. It's also a way how you play with what we have. You know, I don't think that we are gonna do it from small pieces to small pieces.
Rough picture, I think that might help to answer Lee's question.
Actually, but going to what Lee was asking, I believe that setting up the parameters, like what you're doing. Obviously, we wanna focus in different areas, but setting up the parameters, that helps, you know, because it gets the ambiguity of going to the city or dealing with somebody and saying, excuse me, I'm gonna buy your land because I think that I can do this. And then you go and you realize that the neighborhood goes belly up and say, oh my God, you're crazy. And the planning department might think that it's a beautiful development, but then the neighborhood doesn't accept it. So you go through the process during 2 years and then you don't get nowhere. So I believe that having parameters is something very important for a developer. And
There's certainly less risk involved if you're willing to include risk in your marketing process.
If we could just,
Thank
let's
you.
see.
Okay, my question.
Can we move on?
I could, I'm just gonna answer, so, Lee, is it, so I'm Sue Thomas, Senior Economic Development Planner, so we just recently started to do the development, cost analysis, where we looked at cities like Medford, Quincy, Boston, Cambridge, Everett, to understand what it costs for a developer to do business in that city. Those things include, you know, transfer fees, jobs linkage, what's our affordable housing requirements, what's their commercial, you know, ratio, things like that. And I'm more than happy to share that. We're still adding on to it and to show you that. So with one of the things that Dan had mentioned is predictability. And with, you know, Somerville's in a unique spot where we're updating all of that through the zoning overhaul versus, you know, having to do piecemeal development. So when a developer comes in and they do their performer, they're based on, you know, 20, 30-year plans. And they're doing it based on zoning or what's approved right in front of them. But when you update these things within a year or two and require developers to provide more than what they can, that's when you have situations where they're not able to finish out the project to the best capacity that they thought they could. And it kind of goes back to, I think, what Gorka was talking about is if you set the parameters ahead of time so that you're now inviting developers to come in and develop those based on those for sure sort of criteria that they're looking for, and not that they don't have to be in fear that this is going to change in 2 years or 3 years.
And as part of this, have you looked at the history of transit-oriented new growth in Somerville?
Yes, and I think they can talk about that a little bit better.
So what I'd like to do,
This is news to me.
Sure, we just did this like 2-3 weeks ago for the Board of
Okay,
Aldermen,
because-
so I'll have to.
Because I
Sure.
will tell you that for about 7 years, I've been trying to get the city to analyze its own new growth statistics. And we did find out 3 years ago that these were being destroyed. So the great progress that was made until 2 weeks ago was that the data now are being preserved. And I'm delighted to hear that you're now analyzing this.
okay. So I'd like to move on and recap our last 3 meetings for those that weren't able to make it. I'm going to go through these rather quickly because we were really priding ourselves before we left the office today that this meeting was going to be shorter than the last one. But because of questions, it's going, yeah. But shh. So like Dan had said before, all of the previous meetings are available at somervillebydesign.com. It'll give a link to City Cable. So please check it out there. Grab us afterwards. I might not be able to have time for Q&A at this point. So let's dive right in. We met back in February at our meeting 1 to discuss place types, which are a way to categorize places and get people on a common terminology for what a place is, what it might become. We posed the question, we started with what Davis Square currently is. The transit comes every 5 to 15 minutes, but there's a moderate density mix of residential and neighborhood serving retail, and posed the question to the community about what Davis Square should be in the future. And it was really about strengthening it as a local center with a focus slightly more on jobs than housing. Sorry, that's a big red line, but I want to make sure we're maintaining the transit there. Don't think we're changing that. And then in meeting number 2, we started transitioning to talk about environmental psychology. It's a field of research that began in the 60s, really studying how people experience their environment. And they ask questions like, how do we perceive our surroundings? Does it cause a positive or negative reaction? And the key finding is that it affects our mental and physical state, and people make their choice based on aesthetic value. So in that meeting, we dove into one of the 3 physical characteristics called enclosure by looking at massings in Davis Square. A massing is a physical volume or a bulk of a building. It's really just very simply an extrusion. Research found that visual area of a building explained 77% of the variance when they were asked what influenced their impression of a building's mass. So there's 3 ways to do that. The first is step it back. That's an upper story setback. The next is to divide it into 2. And lastly is to set some of it back. So we showed 6 sites, not necessarily sites that were going to be developed, just ones that had maybe 1-story buildings or parking lots, and asked people to place stickers on what massing they preferred. And this is just a result from one of those 6 sites. And then in the last meeting, we dove deeper into the field of environmental psychology, and we really feel it's important because there's 3 reasons that sort of we know we're not getting the results that we're getting today. We have developments proposed that look like this, and after they go through a neighborhood meeting, turn into that. We have people going through big lengths, extended lengths to save historic facades. There's something people find pleasurable about that. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. And lastly, we know our zoning only takes us so far. You've seen this graphic already once tonight, that after a form, what happens? So we spoke of Ann Sussman and Professor Justin Hollander out of Tufts University doing research. And really the beginning of environmental psychology started with how our conscious mind read buildings, and people were asked questions and asked to provide feedback. but some of the work that they're doing is really groundbreaking in that it's looking at our unconscious mind and studying, are our palms sweaty, where are our eyes looking, things of that nature. So in the last meeting, we really dove into complexity and order. Dan gave a great professor-like lesson at the last meeting, so I'll do a very quick run through of that here. But complexity and order. Complexity, everything is like you want to find, you kind of want to find the sweet spot. So in complexity, you want to find the presence and number of different variables or features and the contrast between the two. There's sort of a bell curve. There's too little, there's too much, and then there's in between. And then order is the degree in which something hangs together, something coordinates, something is part of a bigger whole. And the biggest thing here is that ordering patterns help to order complexity. How should I say that?
Organize complexity. The more patterns you have, the more complexity you can tolerate.
Right.
So the bell curve might top out if there was no order at a certain point, but the more order you provide to it through patterns, you can accept more and more differing features on a building.
So our mind is constantly receiving information in faces, in buildings, in conversations, and we choose what to interpret. And what we're showing, Dan gave a great analogy with the matrix that we'll skip here, but what we're showing here is that all these buildings you might consider pleasurable or that you like looking at, but they really provide more information. On the left, it provides less information than the building on the right, providing the most.
Why?
Why?
The corner treatment is more and more complex as you move across the drawings or the pictures. So there's more and more information being projected to us.
So this guy with the goofy eyebrows out of UT San Antonio is also doing research on environmental psychology, and there's a couple quotes from him and Ann Sussman that I'd like to share. The first is that architecture is an extension of the human mind to the environment. And then Ann shared with us that the brain has already decided what we need to see. Previously, we gave an example of a blank wall. Our mind, in a split second, sees that and moves on. So this is a good way to demonstrate the different levels of order and complexity. We can all think of different spaces that are either exciting, relaxing, boring, or distressing to us. And at different points, even in the day, you want to be in different spaces. But an exciting, high arousal, and a good pleasantness, it can be positive, but you don't want to be in a boring space, especially for too long. So, this presentation, maybe?
I mean, a place that somebody finds boring, somebody else might find restful.
That's completely true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you're looking at, that side of the screen, where the gentleman and the fire thing on the other side.
Yeah, yeah. So,
More information.
so these three key points you want to take away. Increased complexity evokes interest. Increased order decreases interest. This is sort of that bell curve. But moderate levels of complexity with perceptible order evoke high preference. So we got in, we did an exercise at that point that we'll touch base on in a few slides, but I wanted to skip ahead to the rest of the presentation from that meeting. And that's the difference between formal aesthetics and symbolic aesthetics. Formal aesthetics represent complexity, symbolic aesthetics represent order. We do have a symbology that maybe I'm pointing out that we have for the first time. You might say, oh yeah, like residential windows on a residential building. If you put commercial buildings on a residential building, it might look out of place.
Commercial windows.
Oh, yeah. And you can see that some stretches of Highland where shop fronts have been converted back to residential. It might be perceived as being a little off. And then you saw this previously in Dan's presentation about structural expression, that there's a sense of order, these columns coming down, and that's happening throughout the square. So we showed a study that was presented last time, one of the case studies that another researcher had done and presented, where they showed six streetscapes to a group of,
200 planners, residents, and architects. And it's just one study, but we used it as an example to show you how these are being conducted.
yeah. To see which was preferred. And the top left is the most complex in streetscape, and the bottom right is the most orderly. I mean, it only changes color, but that window pattern is the same throughout. But when it came to what was most preferred, or excuse me, strongly liked, it was the one with the most order. And when diving into what made this the most preferred is because of the storefronts. So there were two exercises last time. The first was related to storefronts, and we asked you to build your favorite of about 30 storefronts that we gave people. We asked them to, slide it into the elevation. And so there was about 30. Here's a sampling here. Not all are shown, but these were the most preferred, most used storefronts. So the one on the top row, the first two on the left, had all seven groups used that storefront. But going to the bottom right, 3 groups used that storefront. So if you were to compile these all together, this is, from last meeting, the most preferred streetscape for Davis Square. But yeah. So here's some feedback that that was a literal translation of the work that you guys did. Here's some feedback that provides more nuance about why different groups picked what they did. Some groups put some retail on the second floor and even on the top floor. More glass, less glass. One group rotated in between light and dark. They liked that variety. So here's some feedback from that exercise. We also looked at it in a different way about the lengths of storefronts. We did talk and touch on different uses and how they might take up more room, but the smaller storefronts are really preferred from the exercise, and I think that goes along with even feedback we've gotten since 2013 and before, that the smaller storefronts in Davis Square are preferred. Yes?
I just want to throw this in here.
Yeah?
I'm old, so I grew up in the 50s. And in the 50s, my family moved into a modern house, and the gropiest buildings were being fought over loudly.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cities and towns didn't want that kind of architecture. People hated it.
Yeah.
Now, over time, we have evolved our feelings about it, and something that we then felt anxiety over now is pleasing. I fear that what we're looking at in this kind of description is a kind of Stepford ordinance that makes everything look sort of fakey oldie. We're not truly protecting the historic. We're not allowing something to be really of its time and look new. We're not challenging our brains. We're letting them be complacent. And our children will hate us.
Well, I don't have any children, so I'm free of that guilt. But Did you want to add to that?
I was going to say, I have children, I'm young and grew up in the 90s, and I lived in a Gropius house at Harvard, so I guess I'm supposed to like it, but I still hate Gropius.
So,
Less is a bore.
Usually.
so thank you for sharing.
Just for the, I live for the Gropius house. I absolutely love it.
Okay, so we've gotten a wide variety of viewpoints, which is good. I think there are varying opinions on modern architecture. I think what we're trying to do here, I think what Dan.
I'm not trying to talk about modern architecture.
Yep.
I'm trying to talk about how we regulate something that we are not fully comfortable with.
What a modern as in built today building?
As in an idea. So architecture, street fronts are a made real experience. And I'm worried that we are sort of trying to negotiate something that we were all completely comfortable with, and not looking at how to create something that is challenging, informative, interesting.
So, I think that what you're talking about is really like style. Even Gropius, I studied architecture in school, so even Gropius, like all architects as part of their process look at context. They look at things like rhythm, they look at, like I think that's actually part of what the design guidelines really get into, and when we talk about the window analysis and things like that, like rhythm, if you look at in Amsterdam, if you look, or Paris, or any city, it's like you could have a completely modern building, but it's going to be, part of that process is going to include context. It's going to include, maybe somebody is going to interpret the context of Davis Square and like the patterning of windows in a completely modern and interesting way. But it's still like architecture, good architecture, part of the architectural process is contextual, and it is architecture that, I mean, even the Gropius house, a lot of what he did, a lot of the materials that he used were all in response to the context in New England. And so I think when we talk about guidelines, it's extremely difficult, especially in that last view of all the storefronts, to not think about like style and aesthetic. But the conversation isn't, we're not trying to have a conversation about aesthetics in the sense of building style. It's about context and about what we feel comfortable with kind of in the urban environment.
And I have been on the exercise, and I think that the feeling when you did that storefront exercise, I believe that people what that was looking there was the kind of use, not really the architecture. I think that people was looking more on the mom and pops, what do you want to feel on the square.
Right.
I don't think that that was an exercise that was real for, on the architecture, of course. Obviously, it all depends on what building you're talking about. If you're talking about a 20-foot building, you don't have a choice. You need to have two storefronts. If you're talking about a 150-foot long building, you obviously need to pick, you cannot put 25 stores, because if it's impossible to rent, to build, to do all these systems, because it's impossible to build. But I believe that on that exercise, but it's possible to fill it up with mom and pops. So I think that exercise was more focused on who is going to be the end user, or who are we going to have as a...
I tried to do my best to tell people not to look at use, but there's only, as much as you say don't do it, maybe people do it more. So that is a consideration for that exercise, that sometimes that trumps what a storefront looks like. Mm-hmm.
This is kind of related to the design, but I don't know if you have an answer to this, but it's just sort of an observation. When we have buildings that have been built in Davis Square, it seems like a certain percentage of the time there will be like windows. And then somebody will move in and like put up like Venetian blinds that are always closed, or they'll like do like Rite Aid did,
Cover the windows.
block off the window,
Yeah.
or so you end up with your blank wall
Absolutely.
where you try to put in something that, like, you would want to see life there or see something in there to look at, either a display or
Sure.
maybe some fruits and vegetables or something, and you end up not with what you kind of wanted to have there. And it's like, it seems like that's a problem that happens kind of a lot.
Right, the proposed zoning code and any project that goes through the current zoning ordinance has a requirement that they can't cover up the windows. For newer projects, that's an enforcement issue. For some projects, that is a grandfathered issue that, you know, the building was built well before any of those transparency requirements.
I'm kind of thinking of, you know, like the Citizens Bank building, and, you know, like on the part where you can look in and kind of see the desks when you walk by. And
Yeah.
everything. It's kind of not as bad to walk by, but when you walk by the part where they've got it all closed up, and the windows are all
Absolutely,
blocked
that is a
off,
blank wall in
it's like,
our
it's like
minds.
unpleasant to be around, and it's not something that you want. And I mean, this is just an observation, and I'm trying to say that that's something that happens, and I don't know if there's an answer to it, but it may be that, like, the businesses that are moving in are not appropriate for what the space was designed for, and maybe there needs to be like a zoning thing that, like, it has to be a
An
public
active use.
thing on the first floor rather than being a private office where everybody's closing their drapes.
You have a great idea that's already incorporated into the proposed zoning code, and that's for, in places like Davis Square, an active first floor use. So you won't have an office, somebody more likely to draw their blinds, or a bank on the first floor. So if I could turn everybody's attention back to the presentation, this is Elm Street in context, the north side of the street. And the colors underneath are showing the length of the storefronts. And any new development would really match the storefronts in context. This is just a conceptual image, but that's showing that any modern building can copy the storefront lengths that exist in Davis Square and give a similar experience.
So you
Not
keep
the
on
same.
putting like much taller buildings.
Mhm.
I noticed the exercise you did in the previous slide, like you're asking people to kind of put the storefronts on, but it's like 6- and 7-story buildings.
Right,
So is this, so I know like in Union Square, when they went through this exercise, part of the outcome was this document that had like 20-story residential towers and things like that. I mean, is this a preview of what we're gonna expect in terms of like special Davis Square zoning, or?
So in the place type exercise at the first meeting, people chose that. One thing that we were trying to suss out is in Summer Vision, Davis Square is a place identified as to enhance, which means not wholesale redevelopment like our transform areas, but incremental infill development. But what we were getting at in the first meeting, asking about place types, was trying to get on the same page of what Davis Square could be in the future. And that local center selection that the majority of people selected was talking about there's a lot of presentation behind it, that a local center has buildings that are about 3 to 6 stories in height. So when we moved on to the massing exercise, we didn't show anything greater than 6 stories in height. So 20 stories, like as proposed in Union Square and part of the neighborhood plan, is not something that's being contemplated here.
I think it's also valuable to point out that that first meeting probably had the most attendance, about 65 people, I think. And 17% of the people that came to that meeting said they voted for the regional center with high-rise buildings. So there was differences of opinion, but the majority said that's probably inappropriate. We tended to agree, again, if this whole process kind of helps us get a barometer of where everybody's at, and we're not going to come to you and propose something that's wildly out of context from what everybody's expectations are. But there was some parts of the community here that came and participated. Now, that could be the only people that care, that said that, and none of them might exist in everybody that didn't attend. But there was some amount of those people that didn't feel that was out of context, and would like to see that happen in Davis Square. So one thing to remember is that there is always differences of opinions, but we try to understand where everybody's at and what they want to see for their neighborhood, and get a feeling for what that means. And really overwhelmingly, people wanted to see a local center, and local centers, from a planning perspective, everywhere tap out at 6 stories. So that's every other illustration that we made.
We don't have 6 stories.
Yes, we do.
We don't have any 6-story buildings.
Champa Manor, and,
No, but I mean the zoning.
Commercial.
Right.
In terms of the zoning.
It's about 5.
We only have.
No, we don't have
Hold on.
now. Now we have an FAR of 2 and maximum 40 feet.
And the CVS is the tallest building in
Which
the
is
square.
no zoning.
So that's also a good point. But so all that did, though, was inform all of the other pictures that we showed in our presentations. What still has to happen is actual site studies for places that are probable for development. We guessed at 6 that were in that first session, and we're going to go through with all of you to try and figure out what's appropriate for different sites. Let's say it's probably so the parking lot next to Rite Aid is a city-owned lot that could see redevelopment, but we plopped a building down there and asked you for, is this wildly inappropriate or not? If we stepped it back, is it better? You know, we got some feedback about that, but that's not a site study, and it needs way more detail to try and get you to the level of what the type of work that went into Union Square. And some of the sites in Union Square are 4-story buildings, some of them are 5-story buildings, there's 6-story buildings, there's office buildings in different places, there is a podium tower. But all of those, we're referring to their context immediately around them, and that's an exercise that we haven't done yet, and so there's no decision about how tall different sites should be in Davis Square yet.
so this is just another, Barbara?
I'm just curious, because I think I could see a 6-story building on that block, but what you've shown there is a building that's 6 stories, that's half the block. And I think that's what you have this sort of visceral reaction against. It's not just height, it's like a mall, it's like a mall.
Right, so,
So we need all of you to tell us exactly what you're doing right now. That's why we come here and show you, without a biased opinion, what could happen, so that we can get an understanding of, yeah, that building's too long, and then we could write that into the regulations that, you know, 6-story might be appropriate on that corner, but not that length of it. So that type of information is invaluable.
That's why it's done that way.
okay, one more.
All right, okay. The reaction I have on that is that would be a fine building to put in a vacant parking lot, but putting it there, you have wiped out the Diesel, the Burren, McKinnon's, Christo's,
Yep.
And a bunch of other small stores that everybody likes having in the square. And even if you replicated those storefront widths in your new building, you're not going to get those beloved local businesses again. So I would like to take off the table, you know, removing existing commercial blocks, replacing them with things like this, and limit this to like building on really unutilized parcels like the parking lots.
Right, so this development, this conceptual development goes down to the Burren over the 1-story building. And one thing that I tried to present
Love the Burren, we don't really want this.
is, the one thing I did try to present in the first meeting is that things change.
Yeah.
They always change. So when we were picking our 6 sites, we tried to choose things that are maybe economically likely to change. Now, when we have conversations, we do need to talk about the businesses that we like, but we just made it based on an economical decision. And I know there was another site you brought up, a laundromat, that the residents use. So we do need to take this in context, but we do also need to understand that things are changing, so we have to broaden our, sometimes we do have to do show development on sites that have, you know, a beloved pizza shop or other uses, so.
Why do you have to do
It can happen to you.
Yeah.
That property owner could decide to do that
it?
today.
Not the way the zoning is now.
You
Yep.
can replace it with a 4-story building right now.
Up here now, the zoning doesn't allow it.
It allows a 4-story
If
building.
you do that as a
Yeah,
4-story
that's
building,
6.
sure, and that's fine for the public to say 6 is too tall. But I mean, the only way to prevent somebody from redeveloping a building, multi-story, is to zone it for 1 story, right?
I
That's
don't
the-
get why you even put 6 stories when you can only have 4.
Well, because that was the question we were asking you. In
Oh,
that-
you wanna change the zoning so you could put?
No, we asked you what heights were appropriate for different sites, and we gave you 6 of them to debate.
So Stephen, do you want to add to this? And then, I'm sorry, we have to move on.
A series of meetings about design and aesthetics are, I think, called for, and I think the presentations have been great. I'm Stephen Mackey from the Chamber of Commerce, and the idea of democratizing development so that the community has more input and the whole variety of input from every individual who would like to weigh in on what happens in their square, I think is a good, positive direction. Little concern here that after a series of meetings by some outstanding people in design and architecture and presentations about design and architecture all the way to the point of the psychology of things and how the brain reacts to images and that the heart rate is being tested all there about visually, and that we see all the great visual fabric that Davis Square has at the storefront level, and then we show a picture like that that has a great mass, okay, with no character, no definition, no aesthetics. It is not at all going to prevail in the public mind. And the thing that perhaps that this discussion might be balanced with, as it's shared about design and aesthetics and the latest thinking in those worlds, that the community might also be informed about how many people might work on the 2nd floor. Because I might never go to a 2nd floor if I don't work there. But the 2nd floor that has jobs has value. It has value to the neighbors, it has value to the storefronts, and it has value to the 3rd grade in East Somerville. But none of that is explained. None of that is graphically presented. Okay, only what's presented is related to the visual. There is a bias, I would suggest. And the problem is not in the quality of what you've presented and what you're going with. The problem is in the bias of visual and architectural, and it doesn't relate to the fiscal and the economic, that the community is equally well equipped to understand and make judgments about. So that when it sees a conceptual thing about a building like that, it doesn't just see ugliness in mass. It sees jobs, it sees tax base, it sees storefront activity, okay, with those incomes that are up in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and maybe 5th floor. So I think there needs to be a little bit more balance to the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you. No, Stephen brings up a good point. I think personally, we made a decision to show the storefronts to not, and the lengths to not put the cart in front of the horse because we're talking about upper stories tonight. We've talked about mass. We've talked about the 1st floor. We want to get your preference on upper stories. But everything is in context, as already has been pointed out this evening. So your point's taken. We also quickly at the end of the last meeting went through a storefront preference exercise where we asked people what they thought. It ended up being pretty short of getting a quick reaction, which one do you like the best, and people shouting out their feedback. So I'll just show 3 here. These are aluminum storefronts, one having color. These are all brick or stone storefronts, and actually the Orvis was preferred, which was surprising to me. And then last but not least, I snuck in a chain store, even though I told people not to look at uses, and the results there. So that wrapped up our 3rd meeting. And what I'd like to do now is invite Angela to come up. What we asked UTL to do is look at the upper story of the buildings in Davis Square. Not all of them. There's also a lot of one-story buildings as well. And take a look. There's many things that contribute to upper stories in Davis Square, but we asked them to focus on windows and patterning because that's a huge part of it.
Hi, I'm Angela. I am an urban designer at UTL. And so when we're looking at all of the storefronts, we realized that a big part of the urban environment is the upper stories, and that there's all buildings exist. All buildings exist in context. And so when we went through our analysis, we made sure to abstract this as much as possible so that you're looking at patterns, that you're looking at the amount of window, that at the number of different window types and different things like that. And that is all important because they can be interpreted in many different architectural styles. And you can decide that you prefer there being no real rules, but we just want to also first look at what is there first. And so our criteria for analysis was just how many different window types there are in a building, how many different window patterns, and the extent of blank facade. And again, this is just to show you what currently exists, and then it's going to kind of tee up the way that we can look at buildings in our preference survey. And so this is the Citizen Bank building, and we just thought it was important to point out that there are at least 11 different window types and 5 different window patterns, and which is very much in contrast to the Harvard Vanguard building, which has only 4 different window types and 2 different patterns. But
can you get their reaction to either each building as you go through?
Sure. So who finds it enjoyable to walk by or look at the Citizen Bank building? Yeah.
To me, it's an issue of use as much as
Sure.
the building itself.
Yeah, I would say one of the things about environmental psychology, the way you've been describing it, is it's like the first encounter. People have relationships with buildings.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure when they're doing those analysis whether it's people's first impression of things or their 100th impression of things. But we're talking about a neighborhood. Most of us use this neighborhood repeatedly, been in for years or decades. So your relationship is, hundreds of encounters with these buildings, which is not the same kind of thing as, pausing to look at and deciding whether you like an arch window or not. That's all kind of sublimated into your perception, and you're actually perceiving things differently as you go through a space. And I don't think the environmental psychology needs to touch what that is. It's probably different for each person. But I think you can put too much importance and credibility onto things like this and try to make up a set of rules when it's another set that are really important to people.
And that's really valid, and also I'd say that massing totally plays a role, right? So having 11 different window types and 5 different patterns, but the Citizen Bank building has a lot of different pushing and pulling and massing. So I think more importantly, we just want you to be aware of what's here, the character of what's here, and what you do look at every day. Perhaps you don't ever look at the facade like this. Perhaps you've never realized that there's 11 different window types on this building. And so we just kind of want to make you aware of that. Totally different window type. One window type, one pattern. Very boring across the whole facade. And these are all totally different, they're different. This is a totally different style of building, a different era. So this all exists in Davis Square, and I think from just looking at the facades and even in the full views that we've given you, it's clear that there's not necessarily one style, that this isn't Paris, this isn't like Amsterdam, this isn't a city in which you'd say that, oh, Davis Square looks like this, and Davis Square has that extremely strong character. There's traditional buildings and there's also more modern buildings that have significantly more fenestration, like more window openings than the one prior. And so all of that contributes to the way that you see Davis Square, that you experience it. I moved to Davis Square a year and a half ago from Phoenix, Arizona. And my perception of it and how I lived in it and how I moved through it obviously is completely different. But I think that's one thing that I noticed about Davis compared to downtown Boston, and I hadn't lived in either before. And so I'd say
All of these things are important to think about and look at because how we decide or don't decide to make decisions on if we want every building to have no more than 10 window types, if that's something that the community thinks is important because it impacts our perception, it impacts the way that buildings look next to each other, that's something that can be regulated. Or it can be not regulated and,
In the other hand, all the buildings that you're showing there
yeah,
are buildings that were built for a specific use.
true.
That one was,
Isn't every building?
that's right. So, but the use also will
Totally.
will also tell you
About
what
window
you
type.
can- what can be done there.
Yeah.
One was a medical building, the banker building. The other one, the person who built it was the president of the bank at that time. He built it for himself. And he was, the citizens building that was not the citizens building at the time.
Right.
That's a majestic building.
Sure.
And he built it for himself.
Right.
And this is a movie theater.
Movie theater, but with offices on the second and third floors, which is
We're
what
not,
the
and
design
we're not
for.
making judgment calls about any of this, and I agree with you that the type is really important, but we just wanted to point out that, yes, these all have different building types, but they also all have different building patterns and building pattern treatments, and all next to each other, it's created a certain Davis Square-ness. And that is what Davis Square is. And so we're going to move into a preference survey, and we just want you to keep these things in mind. Keep in mind that, right now, all of the buildings in Davis Square are a bit different, and some are traditional, and some are not, and some are this, and some are that, and that's sort of the Davis Square-ness of it. And so.
One of the things Chris, I'd want to point out something is that we're dissecting this piece by piece on purpose because it's really important to get Davis Square right. And we might not be talking about the specific topic that each individual might want to talk about at a specific meeting, but our intent is to get through all of these important issues. And this is one of them. But you're totally right. And we plan to tackle that methodically so that we make sure that we don't leave anything behind. So you're not wrong, and the long-term interaction with the Citizens Bank building might determine that it's more acceptable to you because of its interaction with the neighborhood and your interaction with it over 20 years. But the blank wall at the back of the CVS has an impact instantaneously that will never go away until it's changed from over in total. And or another building goes beside it. And we want to make sure that building doesn't cause the same harm to the public realm that will live years and years. So I understand the frustration that we might not be talking about specific subjects, but we intend to get to every piece of this. And this is a complex puzzle.
I'm just thinking that the way the zoning regulations are in this form, you're adopting a classical norm for how buildings have traditionally gone together successfully. 120 years ago, people didn't need zoning regulations to do that. They just did buildings that way. And they also did them with a sense of craft. We no longer have the sense of craft, but we're trying to preserve the sort of outlines of what things used to be like and hope for the best. And I think what Rebecca has been talking about is that can only take you so far. You might get a whole bunch of really bad buildings that are just bad, classically designed buildings, and it kind of made it really hard for somebody to do a creative, artistic thing which doesn't follow those norms that would be very appropriate for Davis Square. So how do you write a zoning ordinance that, the outcome you're trying to get is you're trying to reduce the chance of bad outcomes.
Sure.
But at the same time, how do you improve the chance of good outcomes
Right.
when you don't have there's not a commitment to craft that there used to be?
Right. I go to national conferences and say the exact same thing. No code is going to replace craft and craftsmanship that we used to have.
Require craft in your building. Can you do that?
That's a level of skill that mass production has somewhat destroyed. But
Buildings are not mass produced. Buildings
right.
are one at a time.
One of the points, though, is to not cross over the regulatory limit, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do is understand what we want to regulate. For instance, storefront fenestration, right, is a percentage. But then the architectural design of the storefront is something that's completely unregulated. We can inform a design review process because the neighborhood cares about what an infill building looks like. So we send it to design review. And the way the design review is supposed to function is that peers are drawn from the public, and your development architect goes in the room with his peers, and they discuss what the design of that building might try to achieve. And design guidelines can try and inform that process and that discussion, because today the discussion is all over the map and it's not producing good results. And so our intent is to figure out where to draw the line with what gets regulated, and then to provide a document or pages within the Davis Square plan that provide direction for design review so that it produces better results without over-regulating development and stifling creativity. So throughout this process is us trying to figure out where those lines in the sand are. Is that? Well, we'll see what comes out the other end, right? So we did prepare an exercise. If anybody doesn't care about windows, we won't get mad if you leave. But there's 12 slides where we wanted to get your input and your gut reaction to what you look at when you see different buildings. So
you'll be getting these little white transponders. It's like 9 choices, but there's only going to be up to 4 in the presentation, so get familiar with those buttons. And Emily, you're taking notes for us, right? Yes. Emily's being a really good planner and taking good notes of everything everyone shouts out. Does everyone have one? Absolutely. Transponder, and practice first by telling me your favorite dessert. So you'll see a little. If you can't see, move up. And A, B, C, and D.
I'm sorry, I only need to use 4 of these buttons.
Right.
Okay.
Is it supposed to light up when I do it?
Is there
It'll give you like a really quick LED flash.
Is there none of the above category?
No. We're saying all genres of pie here. Okay, so we have 15 results, which is about, anyone else? Okay. And then you'll see a result like this, and the majority of people prefer cake. It's settled. More cake shops in Davis Square. We'll code for it. Okay, so this time you only have 2 options, A and B below. Please make your choice about what you prefer. I will say, while you guys are making your selections, we talked about building height before, and we tried to give you examples in the 3 to 6 story range, but sometimes they might be a little higher just to show a design element, so don't hold that against us.
And all we're judging is the windows, correct?
The upper stories, yeah.
Just the upper story. Right, leaving out the first floor.
Yep, the upper stories. Okay, so it looks like everybody's in. And the majority of people preferred A, which is the top photo. Now, the difference between these 2 photos is that they're both one window type, but the top one is in a regular pattern, and the bottom is in an offset pattern.
I see another difference.
Tell me.
The first one is mostly glass, and the second one is mostly not glass.
That's
like,
true.
There are not very many windows in B, and I reacted very negatively to that. I don't know about other people.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add to Ron's?
I reacted to the fact that in B, the windows look like they're lit up, which is nice. Looks like somebody's home,
Yeah.
Plus the irregular thing in the center makes it more interesting.
like a little fireplace.
Okay. A has kind of a
Yeah.
clear story.
Yes.
I reacted poorly to the fact that B, the facade between the windows was just really flat and flush with the windows.
Okay.
As opposed to sort of
The ins and out. Okay. Great. This is good. Okay. We'll move on to the next one. Okay, just 2 samples to choose from here. A on the top, B on the bottom.
One's during the day and one's during the night.
Yeah, that's a lot.
No judging on time of day preference.
Yeah, but it makes a
Yeah, but it makes
difference.
a huge difference.
It does.
One of the, in the application requirements that we've started rewriting for the city, one of the things that we've done is write that you have to make a rendering that's at night and one that's at the day, because the building does look totally different.
Do we require that at a certain hour people leave their window blinds open so we can see their decor?
Typically, no.
Okay, so a little bit more narrow here, but the majority of people preferred A. The difference between these two photos is A is a single window type, and so is B, but B is in a random pattern, and A is regular.
A is mostly glass and B is not. So that's not, you know, you're identifying a difference, but I'm identifying a different difference.
Yeah.
And that's why we want your opinions.
Well, they're both pretty nice.
Well, thanks.
But I responded totally to the shape of the building. Like, it fits in a much more interesting kind of
Windows, Brandon.
Well, one of them's a corner, one of them's a shop. I
Okay.
know, eight.
Okay, A and B again.
I took the one with less windows. I don't know.
Few more, make your decisions. I think 17 is the magic number. Does anybody figure that out? Counted, okay. Okay, so the majority of people preferred B.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
What are we talking about, like, all the windows being the same, all the windows being different?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have a very small building.
Right.
And all the windows are the same, it's different than if you have this giant thing and all the windows are the same.
Yeah, well, you might see some pictures in the future talking about that.
A comment is that, again, seeing some of the windows lit up versus not makes a huge difference.
Okay.
And the other thing that I would say is that I don't actually care that much about the windows in these two pictures. What I care about is that in B there are more trees, that there's more light, it's a more inviting space, the texture looks more interesting. It's not the windows that are attracting me.
A
Okay.
feels way too set back. Like, that is too big, A plaza for an urban area.
So please keep in mind, we do want to look at the upper stories here. I hear your comment about trees, but try, just like I say, don't look at use, you know. I'll try to.
But that's why we're writing down your comments too,
Yeah.
because not having design guidelines for the windows is an option, right?
Hearing me say, I don't care, is important.
Right.
What I care about is not what you're asking.
Yeah. Texture, inviting space.
Like the architecture and the look of the building. So that's what the design review is about. Once you have the parameters, no matter what, you have to go to the design review. That is where.
Right. So we had, I think there was a hand up in the, around the back corner. No? Brandon?
I mean, the reason that you're having us go through the windows is because what you generally read on a building is the windows, more so than people realize, right? I mean, that's what that's all about. So
Yeah,
there's
they're
other
a
factors that
huge
go into
element
it.
to the upper stories of a building.
We're also saying color and shape and.
And that's going to be a lot. Color might be talked about at the next meeting. Okay, so A and B here. Okay, two more.
You got it, 17.
Perfect. Okay, so the majority of people preferred A in this scheme. These are both of these buildings have multiple window types. The top is in a regular pattern, the bottom is in a random pattern, which was actually hard to find. So the option B we think is pretty tough on the eyes,
It also
but
appears to have its facade actually, you know, walled off from the public with a guardrails, like you actually cannot walk in front of this building.
Yeah, it's an optical illusion. I see what you're talking about. That's in the foreground, and that's looking. It's from a elevated street looking over at that building. But
But you're sticking a couple on the floor below that you're not
No, no.
No,
just
you're
from
seeing
where
the ground
photo-
level, but you're, yeah, the guardrails, yeah.
Basically, there's no walkway in front of that building.
There is, it's blocked.
So I'm curious though, you can see light and people in that building.
So I'd be really sad. I'd be really sad if we came up with regulations that didn't allow that lower building to be built. I'd feel like we were overstepping people's chance to explore design. And, you know, I might like one better than the other, but I would like to live someplace where there's both.
I completely agree with you on that. You know, because at the end, it's a choice, and also, like you say, it's an experiment and an inspiration. So you can feel a building to be built round, a round building, or you want to have a triangle or a rectangle.
Or a
And at the,
spiral, undulating.
but at the end, if it's a nice design and it's something that goes well, there's no reason why not have it. So I don't think the regulation, I believe the regulation has to be put in terms of volume, in terms of uses, in terms of many things, but not in terms of design. Because if not, we are capping our imagination. And at the end, that's putting a stop on the future, because that means, excuse me, you cannot have a round window. Why will not? You cannot have a triangle. Why not? There is not a logic reason to say, to stop your feelings on something like that. I believe on volume, yes. I believe on uses,
But
too.
I'd say on volume even, I might like the Singapore Needle in one parking lot if the parking lot across the street could be turned into a park. I mean, to me, we're focusing on details without talking about use and character, and to me, those have to be the guiding principles.
I don't think we need every building to be neo-trad like A, but B is ugly. We can get we can get good modern architecture, and that isn't it.
B might be a theater, a live theater
I
place.
kinda like it.
And A could never be a live theater place.
Oh, A certainly.
I mean,
A
put it
A
this
looks
way.
a lot like the Somerville Theater, actually.
I think, yeah, but I think not.
Okay, over here, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Or a museum.
You and the baseball tee. Yeah, you know, it's got the raglan sleeves, that's you. You.
She works for us.
Baseball. Hi. I'm also thinking of it, trying to put myself into a developer's shoes at a public meeting. I've been on, you know, as a resident and homeowner at some meetings, and like in Porter Square, I've seen some developments that were out of left field. Some got built, some didn't. But the lack of expectations seems to have left a sour taste at most follow-on meetings. Like when, I think it's still called the Long Building, was built on
Long funeral service.
Long funeral, that glass building. So very much out of context, and everything else in Porter Square was killed for about 5 years, 10 years. Very little development because neighbors got so, abutters became so negative. And I think from a practical perspective, maybe the trade-off of cutting out some outlier buildings is that you'll get maybe 80% of people happy enough that development in a good way can happen. And that, I think, is a value that I'm seeing happening here, is figuring out what 80% of people will like. And maybe we lose some outliers. There's some homogeneity cost, but then if things actually get built, getting something built that's pretty good is better than getting an amazing range that never gets built. So
Right.
I just wanted to make that
Eloquently
point.
said. Okay, let's show the next one. 4 options here, so A, B, C, or D. It goes A on the top left, B on the top right.
Let me ask you a question. Are we
Sure.
talking about what we would like to see built in the future, or what we would like to preserve, or just the understood?
We're looking, go ahead.
It's all related to development. So,
For a visceral reaction.
well, it's somewhere between visceral reaction and what you want to see in the future. You're not, only through redevelopment would you change, for instance, A into a different building and get different windows. There's a very complicated process for, once a building is built, for changing its window pattern. So you'd probably see wholesale redevelopment to go from one to the other. we can certainly talk about buildings in Davis Square, and Brandon would love to do this exercise, that need to be preserved and protected in their existing condition or even restored to their previous condition. But this is probably more focused on redevelopment for the future, thinking about the future.
That's not necessarily true.
They seem to be not just about windows, because the scales of the building are so different that you end up comparing like a really big building to a small building and having a hard time seeing the big building as being better. And if it's just about fenestration, then you could crop these things and then it's like looking through an Anderson window catalog, I guess, as to which windows do you like. But I just wonder if in putting these slides together you had a bias, because they don't bias usually towards modern building being better than a historic one.
What we tried to provide here is a variety of buildings, because people do have different preferences, and also this illustration, which 2 other people need to click their buttons on, has 3 window types done in different ways. So each building has 3 window types on its upper stories. So they can provide, that can create drastically different results, which is the point on our slide here. And do we have a bias in selecting our photos? Well, we try not to, but there's millions of buildings in this world, and we got it down to 12 slides. So I guess there is some bias there. But what we're trying to do is start a conversation, and so each slide has sort of, we'll talk about what the differences are in the photos, either before or as we get your reaction to them. So.
Well, so you have 16 now.
Oh, thanks.
Somebody didn't vote, oh well.
Okay, so the gray, A was most preferred. And so show of hands, was that because that's like a building to preserve? You're thinking?
This is the one that got 0%.
Yeah, there's a 0. That's.
I'm surprised anything got 0.
D, purple.
But on the other hand, is also the neighborhood is agreeing on that. And can we get better taxes out of those buildings, triple it, or going 10 times the amount of taxes? But that's exactly what they're trying to do. It's also a way how you play with what we have. I don't think that we are gonna do it from small pieces to small pieces. What they're trying to get is
feedback. And so when we get to a point of writing design guidelines that will be released in draft first, we might talk about a number of window types that people would like to see, maybe a range. And then we might talk about patterning, that if you have more window types, you might want a more orderly pattern. So that's something that I might take from this one slide.
Are you hearing that is something that we intend to be telling you? I mean, are you hearing that we want the zoning to address window ordering?
The design guidelines.
You're telling us, are you hearing that we want the design guidelines?
I'm hearing that other issues, other characteristics of buildings are of a higher priority than window pattern or does individual design, for one thing. It's interesting that none of you voted. You might not have been picking up on that level of nuance. Our bias in creating these slides was the different window types and how they were patterned. And each one of these slides is expanding on that. The first 2 had one window type patterned differently. And these slides get more and more complex as you go on. So it's harder to tease out specifics, but a design guideline might say a building with a variety of windows should also offer a pattern in how those windows are arranged on the facade, without getting into the numbers or a ratio of variety of windows to degree of pattern. But it would provide some guidance for a board made up of peers to ask the question, wow, this is a lot of windows. You have 11 window types. Are you sure that this is they shouldn't be ordered on the facade with more logic, and then they'd have a discussion about it. But it would never get into the level of detail like the setback distance is regulated for a building.
Okay. 3 options this time.
We didn't really get a ton of feedback why people like that. I don't know if you want to go back there.
I normally would say absolutely, but I don't really know how this live polling thing works, if it's going to screw up this slide that I already clicked to. So maybe we'll get both feedback, yeah. So let's do this here, and then we'll collect feedback on this and the previous one without clicking back, sorry. Yeah.
I'd just like to make a comment. Like, I don't like this idea of 6 stories.
Yeah.
And every building that's had like a bunch of stories, like 6 or more, I have a negative feeling, regardless of what the windows are on it.
Right.
So I just want to tell you that.
Right. We, you know, we do our best to find photos that match our previous exercises about 4 to 6 story buildings, and sometimes that's just not possible. So I do want to say that if you vote for a building that happens to have 7 stories, it's not taken as a vote for 8-story massing. It's taken for its upper story fenestration or patterning.
Just my reaction.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
I think that's it. We had another
Okay.
person.
Okay, so B got the most votes here. And so the difference between these is that they're, the top left is an offset pattern, 1 window type. The second is multiple window types in a random pattern. And the bottom left is 1 window type regularly. So
There's your vote for a modern architecture there.
yeah, so somebody tell me why B over the others, or that was 47%.
So I can tell you why I like B.
Sure.
I can tell you that both A and C look to me like the kind of buildings where somebody on the condo board tells you that you can't put anything in your windows. And
What's different about B that gives you that?
B, because it's more random, because some of the windows are smaller, looks more like it's related to indoor living and use space, that's less regimented, and looks like maybe you're allowed to use the space in a way that's less regimented.
So there's a residential assumption.
Anyone else?
Right here and then Gorka. Oh, okay.
I voted for A, and I think I was leaning towards it because the windows are bigger, and I think I've been gravitating towards windows that offer more light. I don't think that's like a requisite. That's a personal preference. I like a well-lit apartment, but my second choice would have been B, because I do like that it's got a sort of more creative vibe to it.
For everyone in the room, sort of C, one thing I would draw from this conversation is maybe that C, the repetition goes too long.
Too boring.
Yeah, yeah.
Unless people are hanging interesting things in them.
Okay.
Then it
You know, the
becomes-
post-it note, like
Right, except
war,
you're
yeah.
not gonna see any of those things even if they're there.
Yeah.
I don't know, if it depends what it is, it depends. If it's a building that people are living in, then people are gonna do all sorts of things to those windows.
Sure.
And they're gonna change.
Actually, you're right, I believe that C is probably a commercial building, and A and B, they look like residential, loft styles, beautiful balconies on the B, on the corner, and A looks great too.
To me, A is the one that people probably most likely to do interesting things with their windows, but that's I think I have a neo-trad bias.
Okay.
What?
What?
All right, we have to move on because she hit the slide.
There's no B, there's only A and C?
I thought the percentage is written down.
I was going to ask the question. So, what if that C is a commercial or office building? Is it an acceptable amount of windows? Do we find it least preferential amongst all of them? Is
Too uniform.
To me, C looks like it belongs in a suburban mall.
do you know why?
I think that it has to do with the scale and the regularity of the windows. I think the fact that the windows are all reflecting there really makes it look like something is almost hidden behind it, or you're not supposed to really see what's in it. And I don't think it looks like it belongs in a neighborhood or a commercial center or whatever we call it.
So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but the environmental psychology literature does talk about the reflectivity of glass, not providing new information. It's actually reflecting old information from another location. And that could be one of the things we see, that there's a lack of visual interest in that. It's kind of drab. Maybe they don't try as hard in office parks, but we see that repeatedly in office parks. So then when you see a building like that, maybe that explains that reaction.
Above the second floor, it's just blue sky, there's nothing being reflected. I mean,
Yeah.
The Hancock Tower is an interesting building because it's reflecting a whole bunch of other buildings.
Yep.
And here that's missing.
Nope. Oh. Yeah, we didn't change the.
Actually,
It's B.
yeah, vote for A and B. Ignore that it says C on it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right. Okay.
There's some like trickery happening behind the scenes to make this thing work, so. Any more preferences out there? That's it. Oh.
Ooh.
Wow. Okay, well.
Any opinions?
I like them both.
Yeah.
They're both can be really pleasant things to look at.
I also like them both. I like the actual look of the A building better, but I voted for B because I like that the windows have balconies attached to them, and I think that adds cool character and invites more people out to the front of the building, even if you're up on the 3rd or 4th floor. So.
The curious thing that we're not talking about at all is skylights. That would also change a lot of this as well, because like on all those dormers that are up on there, that was the first thing that occurred to me. I wonder if those dormers are all going to have skylights in them, because that actually changes the inner space a lot. So is that being thought about in terms of the design guidelines?
To be honest, no, because skylights generally are not affecting the public realm. You bring up a point that maybe they're on the side of a dormer, but
Well, also, in terms of older buildings, it's a big issue to some people that, in fact, that you shouldn't be putting skylights in older buildings, that that's really not something that's appropriate. And there's a lot of controversy about that as well, because it actually opens up space and makes attic space or upper level space a lot more livable. And so that's really positive in a lot of ways. So it would make up for the fact that maybe you don't have enough windows on the building as it is. So it's just another question to think about.
Yeah, skylights are, that's an interesting point. They're more residential in nature, but you see them in commercial buildings, you see them in like big box stores. A lot of times they're not visible from the public realm. You're bringing up historic buildings, which if it was a local historic district, the Historic Preservation Commission would review.
What I like about both of these buildings and why it was hard to pick between them is they both use the corner in a nice way. They do not have a right angle. They both bend around the corner, which adds a lot to the visual interest of both of them.
We'll talk about this next meeting, but the other thing I can't unsee is the chamfered corner in Davis Square and the storefront entrance on the corner.
What?
Oh, here we go. Okay. You got to be faster.
Is that upper building? I might give this away. Is that upper building residential? What?
The first floor, no. But
The first floor on both buildings is commercial.
I'm willing to own the entire 2 top floors, if that's what you're asking.
I would say it could be residential, it could be.
What is it that makes you think it could be either?
It seems like a general purpose building that could be used for several different things.
If I remember right, from the hundreds of pictures that I saved over the last month and a half, this is an office building in London. It's a small boutique office building. But the thing that, we thought was interesting was it kind of takes on a residential mask to itself.
Something that could end up being converted residential if it's commercial use.
Sure, the ceiling heights in commercial buildings are typically built taller than what's necessary in residential, but so they could be converted.
Maybe like storefront channel.
Right, right. I mean, as long as you build floor height high enough for both uses, you could convert a residential building to office uses, upper floor office uses. And you see that in other markets. Our market, you tend to see the opposite happening, but both are possible as long as the ceiling height is high enough. But I think that's one thing that I would learn from this is that a place that doesn't have a lot of office buildings that has a more residential character could find buildings like this more acceptable because it's working to blend in with the residential context rather than blasting itself as an office building, long ribbon windows or something like that in the context. But it's it's something that's very contextual in nature that it would draw from.
Okay. A or B?
We'll tell you in a minute. Shh. You're voting. Yeah, each side is. Oh.
Here?
Yeah, point at the.
Right, that's the question. Right.
Yeah.
Here. Anybody else? Two more? Zero more? Anyone? Okay, I'm clicking. Okay, so the majority of people selected B. The difference between these two photos is that one has projecting windows and one has coplanar windows. Would that be
Maybe recessed a little bit.
Yeah. But what Dan was kind of sort of telling me to shut up about is that they're actually the same building. If you see B here, as it sort of turns the corner, the window type changes.
So there was during some conversations in Union Square, there was a lot of pushback against non-punched windows. So currently it's written in the neighborhood plan. The percentage of glass that's regulated could get at those windows, but it's going to be handled through a design review process. But the public did react and make that known that they see that in the urbanism around them, and they'd like to see that in the urbanism moving forward. Punched windows, that they're not.
Not projecting.
We didn't talk about projecting, but we did talk about.
That's the difference between these two. One of them, the windows are concave, and the other they're convex.
Right. So I'm just bringing up what happened in Union Square in relation to this, but they did talk about windows being recessed from the plane of the solid wall material. That's what they wanted to see because they see that in their existing buildings now.
Not like the idea of these convex windows.
That are punched out.
Yeah.
What we talked about was curtain wall.
All glass versus.
Right.
Okay, so like.
That's at the same plane, even if that curtain wall is between wall material or a window is made at the same plane as a wall material or a curtain wall, they wanted to see buildings that had more punched windows. But we didn't regulate that. We talked about that from a design guideline perspective.
So it was something like A. I mean, I was obviously in the minority here, as I preferred that one. But did people really dislike that kind of thing in the Union Square process?
We didn't show this picture exactly.
Yeah, we didn't have this picture in hand when we did the Union Square process. But.
I liked A just because it's not what I usually see.
Yeah.
And one reason why I live in a city rather than a cookie cutter suburb is because I want to see some things I don't expect to see. So it's not a matter of whether I like it or not, always.
Can we get Philip?
And to that point, and by way of amplifying what Ron said, I mean, I think this is really interesting because those punched out windows, so-called, at least to my eyes, look like, at least in rhythm and form, they're obviously trying to pick up and to some extent contextualize with the building that's right next door to it. Conversely, on the other side, I'm assuming that gray building that you just see the edge of is a pre-existing building, and in a similar fashion, those punched-in windows, to use that term, are kind of rocking with those. And I guess to my neighbor's larger point about allowing for design that is not what you might expect, were you to have that in this case, you wouldn't be able to build this building, I guess is the point I'm working to.
So, not to talk from the back of the room, but one of the things that both sides do is it actually uses a window shape that's more reflective of a residential use. If you remember the one graphic Melissa showed that had a house with storefront type windows on its facade. So that's a characteristic that they both do, but the one still does it through a means that's unique and something that people might not have seen. But there is a property there that's typical of the use in that building.
But you also this might be a way to incorporate new design into Davis Square's character, is by incorporating the same window pattern in a more modern window. Yeah. Yep.
One thing I'd like to point out about the pictures is the angle you took the picture on the left makes it look really squashed in. And the one on the right is more of a head-on thing, so you can see the space between the windows.
Yep.
And I think that's a little distorting and prejudicial in terms of how you might respond to it.
We work with what we have. Dan and I and other planners in the room take hundreds of photos, download them off the internet, geek out on vacations. So if you're that type, please add to our photo list.
Yeah, that comment's valuable for making better preference surveys. Yeah. We definitely downloaded that from the architecture's office photos of the building. But
okay, 4 choices here. You can choose not to vote.
Yeah, because we know 15 people are here, so we can note that down. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we know we're down to 14.
Not voting is also a choice.
Lee's exercising it. Anyone else?
I'm exercising not voting.
Okay, I'm going to click. Okay, some 0%ers out there. Okay, so C was the bottom left, most people preferred, and B in the upper right came in second, zeros being A and D. These are all one window type in different fenestration patterns. The A and D, being what's called a ribbon window, which is one window type repeated. And then B and C are also single building types in different patterns.
I like the irregular roof line on B.
Okay.
Yes, and the
That
building
appealed to me
next
a
to
lot.
it.
Okay. So I would sort of, I think ribbon window buildings, you might want to argue, have sort of had their time. And with this result of 0 people, even though it's a small sample voting for ribbon windows, I would kind of, if I was writing a design guideline, I would say that's strongly discouraged.
A and D are boring.
These buildings,
Based on
these
12
are
responses,
these are both of the ribbon window buildings are corner buildings. So in a streetscape where you've got frontage, you may not have very much frontage. A ribbon window there may make sense, it depends how it's done. So again, I'd be careful how you use your conclusions from this, because you can easily take whatever came out as the top percentage and say, well, they said they liked that best. But I think it's insufficient to draw those conclusions from what you're showing us.
People's reactions to A and D, do you think it also had to do with length or with style?
To me, D actually has a certain kind of elegance, partly because of the simplicity of it and the contrast of it. I don't object to it as much as I might. I don't feel like this is going to provide you with the information that we don't like ribbon windows.
Okay. Emily, which number is this? Do you know?
10.
Okay, so we have 3 more. Do we want to do sort of a rapid fire here? Yes. Okay. 15. We're going to 15.
Come on, big money.
No whammies.
All right, 15, we got some
Everybody good?
Oh, 14,
Okay,
last minute.
so B, top right, most preferenced, bottom left, second preference, no results for A and D. These buildings are showing, A and D are showing a corner.
There's glass wrapping the two corners of the buildings that you both that everybody
and C.
decided to vote for.
And
Did
they're
anybody
solid.
pick up on that when they voted for them? There was a couple.
I heard an I did, yeah.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I see it now.
If the windows in B had been different colors from each other, I would vote for.
Okay.
B looks like it's a commercial, like a mall or something that would have a lot of displays in it and such, would be more interesting to see. I can't imagine some of the movies.
Yeah.
That was B. Huh? That's B. Okay.
A is a perfectly fine building, but it's sort of boring compared to everything else here.
Okay. Next. Yeah, we're not judging Best Buy here. Or Moran's, whatever that is. Okay. About half of you responded. Anybody else?
14.
And click. Okay, so A, thank you for ignoring the use, because I bet it would have been different if you would have been judging uses. And 3 answers here. A, number 1.
D2.
D, number 2, and then C, number 3. So we repeated B, right?
Oh, that's an oops.
Nobody liked it the second time?
Yeah.
Trust me, after putting this presentation together, you see so many buildings, you're like going crazy. But why A?
Diversity in the architectural style and therefore the windows as well.
Okay.
The rounded corner.
Yeah, the tower element on the corner.
The A and D have corner elements where B and C do not.
A has bays with windows.
Okay. Okay, I think this is the last one. You think this is the last one?
Is B built?
Yes, these are all
These are all real photos.
Yes, they're all. We did not
Yeah,
include
no, these are all real photos.
Right, it doesn't look good. It looks like- Right, looks like, are you looking through, is that a see-through building?
There's some balconies and a top metal work element on B. Anybody else? 1, 2.
Nope, all 3 are new construction.
Oh.
Or all 4.
right
I'm sorry, all
here.
4.
Okay, so B was number 1, and a close second, probably by 1 vote, was D. These are.
How do you feel? Sorry to point. I don't know your name.
Carol.
How do you feel about any of these buildings?
Oh, I liked, C.
Are any of them too tall?
Yeah, like D's too big, and A's too big. I like C. I think I'm just responding because it looks smaller.
We were.
That's what I told you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like that.
How many stories are in C? 1, 2, 3, a lot of stories.
I have to say, you know what I'd like to have that little trees on it.
You're not
I know
missing your direction.
So
Well,
Dan's.
I read. I was.
Without trees.
I dig. Late at night, I'm digging through everything I can to find about design guidelines and architecture. And one of the things that I read was an architect talking about how you can use grouping windows together and framing them with solid wall material to actually disguise the height of a building. Yeah, and make it fit in. And ever since then, I've been lobbying to get one slide that showed this technique and trying to go find buildings. Yeah, I share your opinion. I was very interested in hearing it because I think that you have to be very sensitive and you still have to be contextual to your surroundings. But there is an optical illusion related to how you can do that.
D, am I looking through the building or am I seeing reflections?
Bees are reflection.
reflections and lights on.
I mean, I think I picked that because I picked it because it's unusual. There's definitely nothing else like it in the neighborhood. And I sort of like the illusion of the flat facade with nothing behind it. Even, I think that's sort of whimsical.
Great.
In some ways, since you mentioned the pattern of having the columns on the buildings displayed, and you have been showing all the pictures, all my choices has been going to following, first of all, because building-wise, it's much easier if you have those columns going and you put all your features.
Yeah.
But then, storefront-wise, this also makes a lot of sense to play with your building. So in some way, I have been manipulated to always be picking that are going, because it plays well.
Yeah.
That's me.
I think this is
Oh,
really
sorry.
the last.
Last one.
There, sorry. Rapid fire. Oh, boy.
Can you put 2 more floors on B?
But that might
It's
already
still
be done deal.
Looks to me like 4, maybe 5.
Okay, anybody else? We only have 6.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
It's interesting how many of these buildings actually are on stilts.
Yeah.
And that's, but I know we're not supposed to look at that, but I can't help but think that that's a lot of these modern buildings are.
I think that. Okay, so, what we wanted to demonstrate here are, the buildings B and C have a curtain wall. A and D are not, and curtain walls are more flexible than just a sheet of glass on a building, but, we wanted to show, 2 iterations of that in B and C. We got some mixed results here. Are B and A tied?
B, and C are all tied.
Oh, okay. So does anybody just want to give their quick opinion about Barbara and then the gentleman in the gray coat?
Well, I don't know if it's so much an opinion or a question. So looking at C,
which was my choice, it doesn't look like I wanted to know what the reflection is, because it doesn't really look like a curtain wall. Because it looks like there are sections in between windows that are some other material. And is that a curtain wall?
Yeah, it's called spandrel. Did I get that?
Spandrel glass?
And it's
Ah.
opaque, and it can also be of different opacities. So spandrel glass can have like little dots on it to sort of slightly block out what's behind it, but not blank it out.
Thanks. I was part of the A vote because I wasn't liking the glassiness, the
Yeah.
floor to ceiling glassiness. But again, some of that I think is also maybe the scale and width of a building.
Mhm.
Like in B, if like 1/3 of that building was chunked out as a single narrower building, I might
Yeah.
be more excited about it than the half block length of glass.
Yeah. You guys might be reacting to the flatness of it, or the reflect, a little bit of color. There are some extreme colors
I
here.
like the color of B, and that's
Yeah.
much, I mean, I could live with any of A, B, and C, but I think I picked B because I thought the color was more interesting than the others. I'm gonna say, I think it's more interesting, my reaction to D, which is that basically it's too repetitive and too monotonous.
Okay.
Even though it's not really any bigger than the other buildings, it feels oppressive, just, the endless repetition of those small windows.
Right.
Especially going around a corner.
Great, thanks. So,
I like that B looked like it was.
I'm skipping it.
That was important.
We should skip these, it's 10 to 9. Sorry, guys. I think what we're gonna do is, I think we will send the survey out for people that weren't able to be here, because it would be easy for them to check A, B, and C, D. Unfortunately, they'll have to watch some of the video to get they are not picking their selections. Our next meeting, you might have picked up a survey when you walked in the room. We'd like to do that during daylight hours because we want to be out in the square. So that means in the month of May, we can't hold a meeting that starts at 6 p.m. because twilight starts just after that, and we it's not going to work. So please fill out the survey if you haven't already done so. There are Saturday and Sunday time slots to check if you're a worker bee from 8 to 5. So please let us know. This presentation.
Friday, you picked up, you had every other day listed, not Friday.
Fridays get really tough for people because the weekend kind of starts. So they might say, yeah, Friday afternoon works for me, and then they're traveling that weekend. So I thought it gets a little too iffy. Thank you very much for all your time and input. This will be posted online, and we'll see you once we get feedback about the next meeting time, but it's going to be around the 2nd or 3rd week of May, okay? Thank you.
Okay, I had a feeling you were. How you doing?